Well, to discuss the situation more in Syria, I'm joined from Washington by Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian. Welcome to the programme, sir. Dr. Tarpley, the statements coming from Western sources over the Houla Massacre seem to be a mix of realities and speculations. I mean, we have the UN Human Rights Office saying that during the massacre, the government was shelling the neighbourhood. I mean, how could the military have been shelling the place if it had its own forces on the ground there?
I think you'll find that the Western accounts are coherent with a major NATO war provocation. All honest observers know that the fundamental problem in Syria is the presence of NATO death squads that have been brought in large numbers, armed, fomented by the NATO states, and this has now taken on a certain momentum of its own. This is not the first time that the NATO people have tried to get a large-scale massacre that they could try to inflame public opinion with. However, I would cite three on-the-ground eyewitness reports that I've verified myself. First one comes from Fides. Fides is an Italian Roman Catholic missionary news service, and they point to the fact that the reality of the Houla Massacre is that these fighters, right, extremists, Al-Qaeda or Salafi, whatever they were, came in and started targeting the Armenian Christians and the Roman Catholics, the Franciscans, and some others. This is one package. Then we have a Belgian website with an author called Vox Clamantis, which describes in detail how it was done, that the hospital in Houla was burned down and the people that had been taking refuge in it were systematically massacred from up close by the death squads, not by the government. Then we have the Russian journalist operating in Syria, Anhar Kochneva. You can look at some of the work that she's put on the internet, where you have actual eyewitnesses speaking in Arabic, and it's translated into Russian, but there's also a text which you can translate into English if you want to, or some other language, which is similarly the same thing. They say that they are being oppressed by these death squads, in effect, and that they're angry with Kofi Annan and with Qatar for enabling this. So if you put it all together, there's yet a further element, which is that there has been an attempt, it's gruesome and it's macabre, but to procure cadavers. The NATO side, the death squads they sponsor, have been attempting to build up a stock of cadavers that they could then use in this way. The model for this, of course, is what Himmler, Heydrich, and Goebbels did at the Gleiwitz radio station in Germany on the Polish border to provoke war with Poland in August, September 1939. This is exactly the same method that's now being used by NATO in Syria.
But that said, I mean, who would benefit from killing women and innocent children in Syria?
Well, the goal of this is to build up war hysteria in world public opinion, and this has succeeded to some extent because of the controlled, brainwashing Western media, the kinds of stories that have been put out, all one-sided, all quite fantastic. Then it goes together with the idea, of course, that now at least 12 NATO countries and others have kicked out the Syrian diplomatic representatives. So there's an attempt to build up a certain momentum. The Russian delegation going into the UN meeting on Sunday afternoon was already skeptical that you couldn't, somehow the NATO story doesn't add up. In other words, it can't be artillery and tanks on the one hand and everybody killed from up close on the other. That contradiction was obvious from the very beginning. And obviously we need Russia to hang tough, to remain strong on this and not to cave in under this immense pressure. But the idea is either regime change immediately or war and then regime change. And as that Gleiwitz Polish example suggests, this is the kind of thing that gets you on your way to a war. The way the war could come is quite obvious. We now have Operation Eager Lion 2012. We've got 12,000 troops from 17 countries in Jordan, mainly US, Jordanian, and some other NATO. This drill could immediately go live. It could immediately cross the Syrian border, so to speak, and start a war, since the elements, the spearhead of such a war has already been assembled on the territory of Jordan. So we are literally on the brink of a very large regional war.
Indeed. I mean, Turkey has hosted a group of opposition groups ahead of an expected resignation of Burhan Ghaliun, the head of the so-called Syrian National Council. I mean, what do you think was the aim and achievement of this meeting?
Well, Turkey up to now has not taken the plunge. The pressure coming from NATO on Turkey, of course, is that they've got to launch an attack. That would be national suicide for Turkey, because it would guarantee an uprising of the Kurds, and this would tear apart the post-Ataturk Turkish state. So that would be a very, very bad choice. But we're constantly getting reports that Erdogan is looking at invoking NATO Article 4. There is no basis for this. And of course, the so-called Syrian National Council is a gaggle of adventurers. It's a gaggle of profiteers and rent seekers and adventurers who are trying to get money from various Western countries so that they can continue to live the high life in these hotels. And the fact that just after 51% of the Syrian people voted for an actual election, which was open. It was not a one-party election at all. A couple of weeks after that election being successful, the Syrian National Council fell apart just about completely, with this guy Ghaliun resigning. I think that says a lot. NATO is politically defeated, but their only answer to that is to try to escalate it militarily, and for that they've got to use these provocations, which again are just the kind of thing that we saw coming from the Nazis on the verge of World War II. Indeed.
On that note, we'll leave it there. Many thanks, sir, to Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian from Washington. Thanks for your time there, sir. Well, let's take us back to a story we were earlier reporting on, the story of Syria, and that the UN has said that the footprints of established terrorist groups can be seen in Syria. For more on that, I'm joined from Washington by Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian. Welcome to the programme, sir. Doctor, first of all, how surprising is it to you to see UN Chief Ban Ki-moon expressing concern about the situation in Syria? And what does Ban Ki-moon's breaking of his own silence mean to the UN Security Council?
Well, in the case of Ban Ki-moon, we must always suspect ulterior motives, that is, an evil intent. And in these circles that Ban Ki-moon speaks for, that is to say NATO and imperialism in general, the new line is no longer to deny the presence of al-Qaeda in Syria, but to begin to cite al-Qaeda as yet another reason why an invasion and bombing will be necessary. That is to say, if this terrible situation goes on any longer, then al-Qaeda might get the upper hand. We heard Hillary Clinton, in a rare moment of candor in the past week, also conceding the presence of al-Qaeda in Syria. However, we need to point out the reason that al-Qaeda is there is because these NATO heads of government, heads of state, and other officials have brought al-Qaeda into the picture. Al-Qaeda is what it always was, the CIA Arab Legion, and in particular some of the most experienced al-Qaeda operatives were brought from Tripoli in Libya all the way to southern Turkey, to Iskenderun and other places, in a kind of an airlift by NATO some months ago. So much so that when Ambassador Jafari of Syria showed his CD at the United Nations, he said that the Syrian government has these confessions of foreign fighters, including Turkish and Libyan foreign fighters. And I think we can assume that's Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is therefore al-Qaeda. So Ban Ki-moon is just as morally bankrupt as he always was. It's just that he's had to change his mode of attack. The entire situation of this resistance is, of course, desperate. As a result of the Syrian election a couple of weeks ago, when more than half of the possible voters voted under the worst possible conditions, the Syrian National Council is breaking apart, and the leader, Ghaliun, has now resigned. He's out. So there is no coherent opposition. So now they're less worried about trying to pretend that there's a political opposition and more with let's get on with the invasion.
And just imagine if those armed gangs who claim to be the saviors of the Syrian people yet kill innocent civilians and use the human population as a human shield, according to reports. Just imagine they came to power. I mean, what kind of a government would we see? Isn't it paradoxical?
Well, this is, of course, the essence of the imperialist policy. It is partition, mini-states, micro-states, failed states. It's more or less what you see in Libya. We notice that the Western media have been much less interested in showing us the wonders of democracy, the singing tomorrows of the National Transitional Council in Libya, because that country, of course, is tragically breaking up, and you've got terrorist gangs and the beginnings of a separation of different parts of the country. This is what they would like to bring to Syria using NATO bombing invasion. And the shock troops, the people that NATO has on the ground at the moment, are these al-Qaeda types, supplemented, of course, by mercenaries from France, Turkey, and other countries. The specific emphasis we have right now, though, is to try to cut a corridor. And it won't be a humanitarian corridor. It'll be a terror corridor, starting with Tripoli, Lebanon now, northern Lebanon, and this Kliat airport, which NATO would like to seize. That's why we've had an increase in terrorist assassinations in that area. We've had the kidnapping of the pilgrims. This is a thrust to try to get a corridor from the Mediterranean into Syria through Tripoli and the Kliat airport.
And so, according to what you said, I mean, what lies ahead for Syria in the long term, especially in terms of the Assad government? How long can the Assad government resist and maintain his power?
I think the Assad government is politically better off in the last 2 weeks than it was before, because they've successfully carried out a national election, a multi-party election. The constitution has been changed so that the Ba'ath Party no longer has a monopoly of power. I think anybody who was sincerely interested in democratic reforms has participated in that election. Some of them did get elected. The people who have been boycotting it have isolated themselves. They're now exposed as either al-Qaeda or fellow travelers of al-Qaeda. So it seems to me that the NATO political situation has gotten desperate, and their only way out of that is to try to escalate the military side. But there, once again, they risk the collision with Russia, China, and others who are not going to allow them to do that, at least under the United Nations cover. One of the places to look for a possible resolution of this is the Bilderberger meeting here near Washington, D.C. at the end of next week would typically be a place where a solution to that dilemma might emerge, and therefore bears very, very careful watching.
Indeed, and of course we'll keep a close eye on it as well. Many thanks to Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian from Washington. Thanks for your time there, sir.